When we started this project, we were working from the Macaulay Land Use Research Institute, and we've since merged with another Scottish research institute, and I'm from the James Hutton Institute now. So I'm going to talk about lessons from agent-based modelling for sustainability, but mainly this presentation is about talking about how we formalised a lot of the information you've heard about in the previous presentations, and then my colleague Amparo Alonso Betanzos will follow and show you some results. So an outline, I will just give a very brief introduction to agent-based modelling, and it's a big area, it's multidisciplinary, there are a lot of people with lots of different backgrounds in it: computing science, artificial intelligence, economics, social scientists of a non-economic flavour. They're all involved, and they all have their own perspectives on it, but this is mine. I'll talk briefly about one of the low-core models that we've built, just sort of describing it, because there have been actually several during the course of the project, and then how we used the questionnaire data to build empirical models of decision-making within these models, and then used qualitative information to suggest some dynamics that we could also introduce. I mean, one of the main benefits of agent-based modelling as a whole is this ability to create dynamics over time. About how how people affect each other, how people are affected by the environment, and I'll conclude with some observations. So, agent-based modelling is computer simulation that explicitly represents individual heterogeneity and the interactions among them. An agent, or an individual, is the representation in a computer program of a behaving entity, and it can be quite generic. Although in this model we've modelled humans, there are models where they've modelled non-human animals, plants, or even proteins or cells. And there are also models where people have modelled small businesses, households, and governments as agents. Interactions are any effect that one individual can have on another. So these can be sort of interpersonal interactions. We've used norms in the model here. You can also look at imitation, which, if you like, is a form of norm. Markets, a lot of models feature interactions through markets. And there are so-called stigmergic interactions, which may be of interest to environmental psychologists, though, again, not really addressed here, in that there are interactions that are mediated through physical persistence. I mean, the classic example is an ant trail. So an ant leaves a sort of pheromone signal that people follow. But as humans, we also leave writing and signs, and we modify the landscape, and these can affect behaviour. These interactions form a multi-layered social network. Now, by multi-layered, what we mean is that there are different relationship types between the entities. There's not just one kind of relationship type we're looking at, and obviously the ones we're looking at in low-core are sort of subordinate or management, these vertical relationships, and horizontal co-worker relationships. And the best practice, which is what we've done here, is to replicate models using different implementations. Now this is important because as modelers we have to be quite modest. Unlike, shall we say, a lot of the so-called hard scientists, there's considerable uncertainty about how you go about formalising qualitative information in a computer model. So that's why it's a good idea to replicate things, to implement things in different ways and see what happens. So this is the structure of the model, broadly speaking, in low-core. It's been discussed frequently at consortium meetings and also in separate meetings among project partners throughout the course of the project. I wouldn't want to present this as final necessarily, or as the structure, but it certainly emerged from our various discussions. So if we start over here with persons, they hold different posts in the organisation, and they follow different routines. And a routine is something that just puts you in a certain place at a certain time every day. And these routines put them in these regions that create contexts in which they have to make a decision with non or pro-environmental options. I mean, without going into detail, this diagram at the bottom shows different social network structures, and as we compare the results of runs using these different structures, using principal components analysis, we find that the that the parameters determining the structure, determining how many links people have and how big the clusters are, and determining the proportions of different relationship types, all of these are significant determinants of different outcomes in the model. In the more empirical model that Amparo will be presenting, we've tried to use the organogram supplied by case study partners to get social network data. It's also helpful sometimes, I think, just to have an idea of what an agent-based model looks like. I've hidden it a bit, but you get the idea. This window here is a screenshot of the graphical user interface of the model. You can see there are lots of boxes for you to type in files. There are knobs you can turn and adjust parameters. And you can also see a visualization of the space. One of the, again, the important things that we can do with agent-based models is make explicit representations of space. And this, to my knowledge, is one of the first agent-based models where we used qualitative representations of space. It's quite common in agent-based models to try and represent the space realistically. But actually what's important is who is where and whether they can see each other, whether they can observe each other. And so in this qualitative representation of space, which I kind of focused on in the foreground here, you can see that I've represented these different regions where you have an open plan offices or unshared offices on different floors in any one of two buildings. And so this sort of foreground box here is a representation of the NL Green Power offices, the physical building, in a qualitative way. As has been said, we've used the questionnaire as a data source for the agent-based model, and these questions in the questionnaire had questions on individual factors influencing behaviour based on theories and associated scales from measuring them, as you've heard, and on questions on the frequency with which various behaviours are undertaken, either at home or work or with respect to energy, transport or waste. As modelers, again, because we're interested in dynamics, we also wanted to know how often agents tell each other to behave pro-environmentally at work. And this was important for simulating injunctive norms, because we need to know within the model what makes an agent believe that most of their colleagues think they should behave pro-environmentally at work. So we used these norm transmission questions to get us that information and create that injunctive norm feedback loop. Now, to represent decision making, we've used a data structure called decision trees. That's an illustration of one on the right. It's not one from the model, but it's just to give you an idea of what a decision tree might look like if you were trying to decide how you were going to get somewhere. So we start at the top, at the circle, and how far are we travelling would be the first question. That's the questions are represented by diamonds. If we're travelling a short distance, less than 5 kilometres, then the next question we might ask is it raining? If it is raining, we might take the bus. If it's not raining, then there's another question, am I in a hurry? Although usually to do so, you want to do some pre-processing. This can involve simplification of the explanatory variables. This is where you might do clustering to create classes of people within groups of variables. You might reduce the number of explanatory variables using a technique called feature selection. So you might only concentrate on variables to create the decision tree that have a good correlation with the response variable. You might also simplify the response variable. So instead of representing the full Likert scale, you might chop the response up into 3 using terciles or into 2 using medians. The great thing about them as well is that they're clear and easy to interpret for non-experts. So there are other alternative approaches in the machine learning literature for mapping explanatory to response variable, but it's often very difficult to understand what has been created. And although these learning algorithms cross-validate and provide quantitative fit to the data, so they're often quite rigorous in the way that they're built, best practice is still to qualitatively assess them. And so you don't necessarily take the answer you got back from the statistical technique, you might go through and assess them. And so some of our poor colleagues in the case studies have had hundreds of these decision trees to look at and sift through and criticise. But in this way, they do integrate to some extent qualitative and quantitative knowledge. And in low-core, we can argue, perhaps, because the questionnaire explanatory variables are based on numbers of different theories of pro-environmental behaviour, that the decision trees integrate these theories to some extent. Again, to make it concrete, this is an example of a decision tree for recycling paper at work. We start at the top. If you have a low identification with the organisation, and if you have low self-efficacy, then you're in the lowest tercile. You're the least likely to recycle the paper. On the right-hand side, there's an interesting one in which, although you have high identification with the organisation, if other people are encouraging you to behave pro-environmentally at work, that's NIL.2 being more than 4.5, so if you've got a high norm transmission from your colleagues, then that seems to have an adverse effect. That's just the way that the algorithm developed it. Now, what's interesting about these variables is that we don't use the response from the questionnaire that the respondent gave. We use another tree or some other algorithm that tells us whether a norm has been transmitted. So there is another decision tree fitted to the data that tells us about norm transmission. So norm transmission is another response variable. It's quite interesting to contrast the variables that are used to construct decision trees in case studies. Here I've put the Dutch and Italian case studies side by side because they show some interesting differences. Now, whether these are cultural due to the company or due to the country is not clear, but normative influences are stronger. These red lines on the right-hand side are stronger in the Italian case study, and the more individualistic psychological variables, the worldview, self-efficacy and environmental self-identity, are more important in the Dutch case study. What that means is that when we run scenarios through the models, we run the same scenario through two models, we can expect different results. And I mean, the take-home lesson, I suppose, would be that we may need to tailor measures and interventions to organisations and countries recognising differences in culture. Qualitative rules, again, we can take these decision trees and these create dynamics, but we can also add further rules in which information in the model is used to influence the psychological explanatory variables. So, for example, self-efficacy could be influenced by whether there are structural factors in these qualitative regions that prohibit or facilitate pro-environmental choices. So if the region makes it easy for you to make a pro-environmental choice in a particular context, we can have that increase your self-efficacy as a feedback loop. And these are some other examples of feedback loops we can introduce. And again, there's no one way to formalise these given qualitative rules, because we don't know how much it increases your self-efficacy, of course. So we have to be modest about the results from models that these models create, but we also need to realise that it's important to do replication, to do things in different ways so that we can see how much that has an effect. We can then also interpret backcasting scenarios in various ways. These are sort of creating the driving variables coming at the top of that diagram at the beginning. So in the UDC case study, we looked at cutting car use. These are just examples. In the NL Green Power case study, we looked at creating a campus. This was the Green Office scenario where they were going to create campuses where people lived near where they worked in suburbs of Rome. In Groningen, strengthening the biospherism, and in Aquateam, allowing employees to work from home. These are just examples. There are some other things we looked at as well. We've also looked at the integration themes that have been identified and will be described at length in the deliverable 6.2, the integration report. And there are various measures that we can introduce into the model across all the case study to see how these integration themes or the formalizations of them play out in the different case studies. I won't go into detail because of lack of time. So in conclusion, the decision trees offer a transparent way of representing combinations of influences on behaviour, and they allow for correlations in subpopulations that are not necessarily present in the group as a whole to be factored in. So it might be that for some people, for example, with high self-efficacy, the personal norm is a strong predictor of behaviour, but for other people with low self-efficacy, it isn't. A decision tree can capture that. Differences in influencing variables among case studies reflect important differences among case study organisation cultures, as I said earlier. Agent-based modelling has highlighted the importance of social network structure as a mediator for normative influence. So I think one very interesting possible direction for future research would be to look at organisations with very different corporate structures. There's a games developer where they claim to have a completely flat hierarchy, so no hierarchy at all. There are no managers. Everyone's a co-worker. So can we compare the kind of pro-environmental behaviour in these organisations with ones that are very strongly hierarchical, for example? And qualitative and quantitative information can be integrated successfully in agent-based models. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.